Good afternoon. Today I'm going to be covering the rest of chapter 25, which includes two of the PowerPoints on the 1950s. Question to observe while you're watching this is the 1950s conservatism, complacency, and contentment, or anxiety, alienation, and social unrest. 1950s are widely considered one of the most successful economic periods in American history. I would take it from 1945 to 1972 as the greatest economic experience in American history. I doubt it will ever be topped, mainly because 90 to 95%, if I haven't mentioned this in class, of products manufactured in the United States, from steel to automobiles and other household goods and products, and the growth of supermarkets and highways. It was just a great time. Obviously, the anxiety and the alienation, the social unrest, still dealing with Jim Crow segregation and discrimination. Certain, Black Americans, Latino Americans, and other ethnic groups. However, across the board, statistically across the board, uh, obviously, any period is not great for every single American, but across the board during that time, that 1945 to 1972, percentage-wise, standard of living for all improved, if you want to look at it that way. Another reason for the boom in products and the purchasing of houses and mortgages and interest rates were low. Baby boom occurred. This is a note you might want to take for the final exam. An astronomical number of births due to servicemen returning from war, reuniting with their girlfriends, getting married, and reuniting with their wives, and of course, uh, that period between 1946 and 1964, massive increase in which also led to the need for the construction of houses. One of the first, William Levitt, the what would lead to what we now have, the gated communities, housing developments. It starts here with Levittown in 1947. Got so proficient in 150 houses per week. Now, this is where suburban life. It's the area in between the concentrated, densely populated cities and the not so populated rural areas where you have houses and farms and rural communities that your neighbors 5 miles down the road. So in between is what we call suburbia. There's a look at the shift in population distribution from 1940 to 1970s. You see in 1940 only rounded up to 20% lived in suburbs. By 1970, 41. And more people live in the suburbs by 1970 than they do in cities and small towns. A lot of these communities were planned, including Olympic-sized pools, Little League baseball fields, multi-purpose community halls, centralized shopping centers, so on and so forth. A lot of them are laid out the same. If any of you live in housing developments or gated communities, maybe the houses in those communities might be very similar. You could go across the street to your neighbor. Maybe the house might be flipped, but the square footage basically and the layout's basically the same. Yeah, one thing that portrayed suburban living were the television shows at that time, from the Donna Reed show to Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best. And these were shows that tried to promote what were called American values, family values. Problems were solved in 30 minutes. This is the precursor to your 30-minute sitcoms, situation comedies, and then later hour-long dramas. that are mostly prevalent today. As you see there, for the most part, the portrayal is mostly, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant characters. If any people that were, black or Hispanic, most of these shows would portray in kind of a stereotypical fashion, maids, janitors, mechanics. That would later change, realistic portrayals in the 70s and 80s. But this was the basic formula for television. Credit cards, but this time different from the 1920s. There's credit could be checked and limits would be put on credit cards, but also led to purchasing of new consumer products. Once again, war with World War II and the technological developments, that strange paradox of history where, technology to promote warfare, transfers into consumer products. It's usually the case. Unfortunately, it is the case. That's just a paradox of history. These new items, that technology that went into radar and sonar and all that, translated into television and transistor radios and other household items. You also have computers in a changing workplace, such as the Mark I, which is the first IBM mainframe computer. There's another computer that I will want you to know for the final exam. You don't need to know this, but this is where the term in the corporate culture where we still label, white collar versus blue collar jobs. White collar is more, office type, teachers and professors would be considered white collar, and corporate positions, managers in the corporate world considered white collar, where blue collar is mostly it could anywhere from physical labor, but also skilled physical labor, like your carpenters and plumbers and electricians would be considered blue collar, as well as those that, a construction worker that does the lifting and the mixing of the cement, not considered a skilled worker, but still considered a blue collar worker. Want to take notes on the Interstate Highway Act in 1956. The 1950s is also known as the culture of the car. As you see, between 1945 and 1960, car registrations more than doubled. There's two classic cars there, the 1958 pink Cadillac, 59 Chevy Corvette. But President Eisenhower had taken a trip across the United States, which took him by automobile almost 2 weeks, where certain roads ended. He had to backtrack and take other routes. It just was a mess, and led to the passage of the Interstate Highway Act, where, best example I could give you is Interstate 95. And 41,000 miles of new highways would be built. That way, it was easy access. Once this was complete, interstate highway from north-south and then east-west, I-10, if you drive up to, Jacksonville or Tallahassee, if you go to Tallahassee, you can pick up Interstate 10 and it'll take you all the way to California. So you can make that trip in 4 days. Culture of the car. The interstate highways also led to construction of motels and rest areas. More businesses would grow that way. One of the most famous routes to take was Route 66. Vacations become part of the American culture. Again, job payment job employment improves to the point of many companies offered paid vacations, and families packed up the car and went on vacation. I'm sure some of you have done that. One of the areas to go, one of the vacation spots, which opened in 1955, Disneyland, Southern California. You can answer that question. When did Disney World open? Uh, give you a minute or a few seconds. Disney World opened in Orlando in 1971. 1971, thus giving people in the eastern part of the United States a little quicker access. It's quite a trip to take out California. So now you have the option of going to Disneyland if you live west of the Mississippi, and going to Disney World if you live east of the Mississippi. I had mentioned the TV shows and the portrayal of suburban living, and look at the increase in television. 1946, there were only 7,000 TV sets. By 1950, there's 50 million. At first, as television develops and it becomes easier, less expensive to make televisions, of course, the price would come down. As with anything, any product. For instance, if you bought PlayStation 5 when it first came out, it's a lot more expensive than it is now. A few years later, same thing with television sets. When they first come out, sometimes, if you had a good relationship with your neighbors and your neighbor bought a TV, sometimes they would have a block television party where you'd be invited over to watch, a show like the Milton Berle show or the Jack Benny show or all those shows I showed you before, Leave It to Beaver, I Love Lucy, and it's like a potluck. You bring something to munch on and snack on, and you'd sit with your neighbors until you could buy your own television set. All their TV shows. There was this affinity towards Westerns. Of course, the portrayal of the West was not entirely accurate, but it was entertaining. Davy Crockett, the Lone Ranger, Sheriff Matt Dillon, Gunsmoke, the sheriff of a Western town. And, Americans just fell in love with it. This became part of the American identity, Wild West. There's I Love Lucy, one of my favorites on the right, The Honeymooners. The word teenager, might want to take this down, in the 1950s entered the American language. And this by 1956, and we're clearly in the era of rock and roll music. I'll show you a little video on that in a little bit. But $7 billion to spend. By 1956, a lot of teenagers were getting, jobs, delivering newspapers, cutting the neighbor's lawn, babysitting. A lot of parents had extra money. Maybe chores around the house could earn you what's called an allowance. And so much every Friday or so, or beginning of the week, whenever mom or dad to slip you a $5, whatever it was. And some teenagers, a lot of teenagers, you see $7 billion. And you see the records laid out on the floor. Teen purchasing power had very much to do with the increasing popularity of popular music. And these teenagers are not listening, for the most part, to the same music their parents are. And with transistor radios at night, when mom and dad went to bed, some of these teenagers would be curious to find a station that played what they called race music, which came out of the African American communities and culture. Me personally, very grateful for that. Playing the piano, playing the guitar, I fell in love with the early blues and rock and roll that came out of the African American communities in the South, which originated with gospel. We'll get more into that in the other PowerPoint, but yeah, most definitely. Those teenagers of the 1950s influenced the popularity, the rising popularity of their own music. Teenagers might have respected the music of their parents. They kind of, put up with it. But, and many teenagers had their own rooms. This is when it all begins. They're not sharing their rooms with their brother and sister. I mean, that still happened, but having your own room, having your own transistor radio, and buying your own records, maybe hiding them under your clothes. You might want to, instead of Pat Boone, who was more of a white vanilla artist, easy sounding. He was talented, but easy sounding, nothing threatening. But the teenager buys a record by Chuck Berry, Little Richard, or Elvis Presley. It was dangerous to many parents. Hide that record and play that when your parents weren't home or your parents went to sleep. The term juvenile delinquency comes into play. Two characters here portrayed in cinema. Marlon Brando, part of a biker gang in a movie called The Wild One. Marlon Brando would later have success as an actor in movies like On the Waterfront, Streetcar Named Desire. And if you're into, gangster mob type movies, he plays Vito Corleone in The Godfather. James Dean, a rebel without a cause, teenagers looked up to that character, flaunting authority. His character in Rebel Without a Cause is not conforming to society's rules. James Dean was really took off. He only made 3 movies. He made Rebel Without a Cause. He made a movie called Giant, and he made a movie called East of Eden. And he came from the same kind of acting school that Marlon Brando came from, a acting teacher named Lee Strasberg, who introduced method acting. Method acting basically is becoming the character 24/7 that you're portraying, taking it home with you. Eat, sleep, walk around, everything you do has that character. Other actors that have used the method, as they call it, Robert De Niro does it, and so does Al Pacino. But like I said, James Dean only made 3 movies because he liked to drive fast. He liked to ride motorcycles, but one night he was driving his Porsche and wrapped it around a tree. So unfortunately, we never got to see. He died, and we never got to see him. He probably would have been a legend, no doubt, no doubt. He was a legend, but he became more of a legend because he died. I think he would have became like a Hollywood legend for future generations had he lived and continued to act. In the 1950s, it's just before the hippies of the 60s, you had the beat generation of the 50s. It was actually introduced by Jack Kerouac, 1948, referring to the underground anti-conformist youth movement in New York, known as beatniks. On the beat, that phrase "on the beat" was used to describe what a policeman walking the beat. That's the neighborhood they patrolled. And a beatnik refers to a young person who is anti-conformist, flaunts the rules, has a disdain for authority and materialism. So before the hippies of the 60s get more associated with communal living and anti-establishment, anti-government, you had the beats of the 50s with kind of, transfers or translates into the 60s. Standard behavioral rules were obey authority, control your emotions, don't make waves. This is where parents thought that performers like Elvis Presley threatened that, his sexuality on stage as they perceived his movements, his gyrations, were promoting sexual activity for teens. This obey authority, control your emotions was in direct contrast. This is what the Beats were trying to uh, push against or fight against. There was also a religious revival. Hollywood's apex biblical epics, maybe some of you to watch, especially the Ten Commandments during around Easter and Passover. Gender roles became defined. The ideal 1950s man was the provider. There were cases of single women, mostly in urban areas, of single women that had worked in factories during World War II when to get their education, but were still subjugated to getting secretarial jobs and living single in the cities. But for the most part, the suburbs and the rural maintained traditional gender roles. Let's see. There were contradictions to well-defined gender roles as changing sexual behavior. Alfred Kinsey is a professor of biology at Indiana University, conducted surveys. And although the 1950s is portrayed as, the purity of young women and no sexual activity before marriage, so on and so forth, no extramarital affairs, that's the on the surface that I would say that it is, delusional and fantasy, in reality, all those things occurred and premarital sex was common, extramarital affairs were frequent. So, the more things change, the more they stay the same, probably the same percentage per population was having premarital sex in the 50s as they are now and extramarital affairs. But, what was important was how it was portrayed. But for historians or history students or professors like myself, the more things change, the more they stay the same. It's how it is perceived. We're more used to it now, so it's more accepted. But in the 1950s, it's behind closed doors. But it's still happening. Duck and cover generation. This, I mentioned it before, and some of you made a comment. What good would it do to hide under a desk under an atomic or nuclear attack? That's what you did. And you see at the bottom, people actually invested in bomb shelters. That's a bomb shelter. So this would be dug underneath in your backyard. In case of an attack, you're watching the news or you're listening to the radio, and go to your bomb shelters immediately. The Soviet Union has launched a nuclear weapons towards the United States, and there would be a hatch, an entrance that can be sealed once the family is in, and of course you've stockpiled food, water, so on and so forth. And there you see the beds, and there were bomb shelters salesmen that would be knocking on your door between the 1950s and 1960s. To sum it all up, the booming prosperity of the 1950s did create a widespread sense of stability, contentment. However, there will be challenges because not every aspect, not every sector, not every group, ethnic and racial, even though, as I said in the beginning, across the board, statistically, standard of living was better for everybody, but it's great for some people and not so great for other groups. And we'll see that challenge in the beginning of the civil rights movement and in the 50s and 60s. Well, we have a separate chapter. That'll be chapter 26. So that's one. This is the 1950s American Culture 1 PowerPoint. This is the 1950s American culture two. Maybe some of those faces are familiar to you. You can point out Elvis Presley, Marilyn Monroe. There's Chuck Berry, President Eisenhower, bottom left, Jim Brown with the football helmet, Rocky Marciano, the only undefeated heavyweight champion, and all due respect to Floyd Mayweather as a middleweight. There's James Dean, top right corner, Liz Taylor, John Wayne, Maureen O'Hara, Mickey Mantle, famous Yankee player between Elvis and Marilyn. Definition, history of rock and roll. Sure. Make sure you take this down. Comes from the cotton fields. Out of the evils of slavery, something beautiful, nurturing, passing the time. We love music. We love to dance. We love music. And it, believe it or not, comes out of the evils of slavery. And cotton pickers who had a leader known as a cantor who leads every song, and then field slaves repeat. But this, who would have known it would translate into musical instruments and singing, and provide the foundations of gospel, blues, jazz, and even country music for provided entertainment for many white sharecroppers who were also just as poor as after the Civil War as former slaves were. And country music would provide that solace. And a lot of it's the same. If you play an instrument, chord progressions and many blues songs and country songs are exactly the same. The styles are different. If you do play an instrument, I mean, to help you understand, if you don't, if I was to play a blues song in the key of E and the chord progression is A and, B, same would be, I could sing it country style and the same chords and the same progression, but the style would be different, but the chords are the same, if you understand what I mean by that. You do have, I call them the big seven. And what from gospel into blues, different styles, but again, you could play it the same. You have the big seven from Mississippi. And blues was a term coined by a disc jockey who played this style of music. And about, 60% of it has a sad, if you have the blues, you're sad, right? There was 40% that had a lot of attitude, different, a lot of machismo, a lot of attitude, the singer's exploits and his, his gambling or the women that he encountered, kind of like a chip on his shoulder. That was about 40% of it. But since 60% of it was kind of sad, songs like, if I didn't have bad luck, I wouldn't have any luck at all, that kind of attitude. But those four, Robert Johnson being the father, he's pictured to your right. Others include Willie Dixon, who was a great songwriter. Willie Dixon wrote many blues songs for other artists. Future artists like Eric Clapton, the Rolling Stones would adapt many of Willie Dixon's songs in the early part of their careers. Elmore James introduced the slide to the guitar, which is a cylinder, sometimes made of plastic and metal that you put on one of your fingers. I'm more comfortable with it on my pinky when I play the slide, and it elongates notes. Muddy Waters. The reason the Rolling Stones got their name is because of a Muddy Waters song titled Like a Rolling Stone. His real name was McKinley Morganfield. John Lee Hooker was the guy that brought the attitude and the sound. A lot ZZ Top, if you're familiar, if you want to Google ZZ Top, a song called LaGrange is basically a ripoff of John Lee Hooker. Howlin' Wolf in his singing and his ability to play harmonica influenced the lead singer of the Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger. and B.B. King. Uh, Probably the most popular guitar player of the group. He would later work with people like Eric Clapton, and he was also very, very close friends with Elvis Presley. So all of this comes out of Mississippi. That's why it's called Native Mississippi music before it was mistakenly labeled blues. There was another native of Mississippi. I call him the son of that core seven because he grew up around it. He grew up in a very, very, very poor, the poorest part of Mississippi known as Shake Rag. One of the only areas in the South where poor whites and poor blacks lived as neighbors, went to the same church. It was very, very rare, but they're on the same economic level, so they had a lot in common. You know, Elvis Presley's house did not have any running water or electricity. And this is where the black preacher in the church in town, I believe it was Baptist church, encouraged Elvis to sing at a very young age. You know, he was singing in a choir when he was 7, 8, before his family would move to Memphis, Tennessee. But he is a native Mississippian. He will be the only artist to be inducted into 4 music halls of fame. He's inducted in the gospel, blues, country, and rock and roll halls of fame. I doubt you'll ever see that again. Not because there aren't artists that are as talented. I think it's most artists will stick to that one genre that's made them money and really don't have time to start producing records in other genres. You know, Presley did it all. So you have to put out, not that it can't be done. I'm just saying, I don't think it will be done, but you would have to put out a serious amount. If you're an artist today, let's say, you know, whatever, whoever your most popular artist today, you'd have to put time into producing a gospel album, blues album, a country album, pop album, hip hop album. You know, they all have their separate halls of fame, but you know, that's not easy to do. Or does someone want to take the time to do it? But he did. Along the way, disc jockeys played a major role. So you have teenagers purchasing the records that are played by the disc jockeys, which make the artist famous. That's how the formula works. Alan Freed, top right, top picture. He coined the phrase rock and roll. It's a euphemism for sex. Rock and roll is a phrase that are used in many of the blues songs that were written by these gentlemen. He couldn't come out and say having sex in his records. He had to use euphemisms. Shake, rattle, and roll, rock and roll. Bless these two. They were colorblind. Alan Freed and Sam Phillips. They didn't care. They loved the music. They were willing to play records that were recorded by, didn't matter if they were green, white, red, yellow, whatever. It was the music that counted. And, you know, in a time that took a lot of guts. Alan Freed was fired from many radio stations for playing rock and roll. Sam Phillips, another one with a lot of courage at a time when he could have been lynched, strung up. Ku Klux Klan was very prevalent in the 50s, especially when the civil rights movement begins after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, and it affected all aspects of life. So people like Alan Freed and Sam Phillips became a threat to the white establishment, especially in the South, that didn't want their white teenagers listening to black music. And they didn't want their children. What's even worse for those people was a white guy singing black. That means blacks were accepted as equals. That's how important Elvis Presley is as a bridge. A white Southerner singing black in a time that, I mean, Elvis, I could show you videos, you know, of white citizens councils that filmed advertisements banning Elvis Presley records, or Elvis Presley's not gonna, I mean, just outwardly saying it We're not going to let Elvis Presley sing his N-word music in our town. So you face that kind of resistance, but to a lot of teenagers across the country, it was reviewed as rebellion, and anything to rebel against was good, against authority. So it's a perfect storm, you know, for the development of popular music, which you still enjoy today, you know, as it progressed through the decades. So you, as listeners, as the audience or performers, are standing on some big shoulders that paved the way and had to face violence and threats and, you know, resistance before their music would eventually be accepted and passed on through generations. Sun Records is I'd have to go visit that place. Have to. In Memphis, Tennessee, the same time where Elvis would purchase Graceland. Great artists performed there, both black and white. This one photograph was, I don't know if I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with either two or three of these artists. Johnny Cash, who became a country music legend. You know, Elvis is sitting at the piano. Johnny Cash is in a green sweater. Carl Perkins, who he would become a hero to bands like the Who and the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. His songwriting and musical arrangements. He became a legend himself. Carl Perkins. He's wearing a blue collared shirt, and then there's the Killer. I'd rank him top 5 rock and roll pianists. Interesting that Elvis is playing the piano in that picture, not Jerry Lee, because Jerry Lee was much more accomplished on the piano. Elvis was good, but he was more of a guitar. But Jerry Lee was the man on the piano, no doubt. And they happened to just show up, and a picture was taken, and it became known as the $1 Million Quartet because eventually all of them would be worth $1 million. What their music is going up against is bubblegum, light melodies, innocent lyrics, wholesome singers. Perry Como, bottom left. Rosemary Clooney, top. And Pat Boone. I mentioned Pat Boone before. And he would do these innocent covers of really hard driving songs like Little Richard's Tutti Frutti. You should look up Pat Boone's Tutti Frutti versus Little Richard's Tutti Frutti. You see the big difference. Richards is much more dangerous, hard driving, growl, yeah, down and dirty type. And Pat Boone's is kind of like a, sweet little, not threatening at all. If you have a chance, compare the two, you'll see what I'm talking about. Sun Records in Memphis, and then you have its counterpart, Chess Records in Chicago in 1955. Leonard Chess and his brother introduced Chuck Berry and also signed Muddy Waters to their record label. Again, willing to record. Leonard and his brother, Leonard Chess, they loved the music coming out of the Black community. And whether it was a white artist or a Black artist performing that music, this is what they wanted to do. And there's a great movie called Cadillac Records, if you ever want to, which is a portrayal of Leonard Chess and Chess Records. Rock and roll goes to TV. 1952, American Bandstand. It's almost like your precursor to MTV. Okay. You made it on American Bandstand, went national, your national exposure. Just like if you put out a video on MTV a long time ago, the whole country's watching MTV. You had cable TV. And that increased record sales and popularity. Here are some artists. What I'm going to show you is a brief little video on the top 10 rock and roll pioneers before we move on.
It's only rock and roll, but we like it. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we're counting down our picks for the top 10 rock and roll pioneers. Number 10, Ritchie Valens. Even without a full-length album to his name, Ritchie Valens opened doors for Chicano and Latin rock. All he needed was the number 2 hit Donna and a rocking rendition of the Mexican folk song La Bamba to become one of rock and roll's first teen idols. Though he died too soon in a plane crash along with Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper, Valens' sound continues to shape music today. Number 9, Carl Perkins.
Well, it's one for the money, two for the show. Peter, get ready now, go, cat, go, Step on my blue suede shoes.
This country boy's dream became reality after the self-penned Blue Suede Shoes topped country charts. Thanks to his superb guitar licks and singing style, Carl Perkins became an expert at combining rock and country music.
Let's go, guitar.
The king of rockabilly was also an excellent songwriter whose tunes were later performed by greats like Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, and Jimi Hendrix. Number 8, Fats Domino.
Found my thrill.
Credited with writing and performing one of history's first rock and roll records, Fats used his welcoming vocals and blues-influenced piano playing to score over 30 top 40 hits. He brought together electric guitar, drums, and saxophone, and soon became the best-selling black rock and roll artist of the 1950s. By expanding on the New Orleans R&B sound, Fats Domino also inspired the later creation of ska. Number 7, Bill Haley and his Comets.
We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. Put your slack rags on. Join me home.
Accompanied by his Comets, Bill Haley unleashed rock and roll into the mainstream with the hit Shake, Rattle, and Roll. He made sure rock and roll was here to stay with his chart-topping Rock Around the Clock, and cemented himself as the genre's first white superstar in the process. With 100 million albums sold, it's no wonder he's called the father of rock and roll. Number 6, Bo Diddley. He may have only had one album crack Billboard and one top 40 hit, but Bo Diddley wasn't dubbed the originator for nothing. Along with his blues and R&B tinged rock and roll driven by electric guitar, he crafted a rhythm that's been adopted by countless rock and pop musicians, the Bo Diddley beat. Meanwhile, his booming voice and animated playing on square guitars made for very memorable performances.
Oh yeah! Oh yeah! I want everybody to clap their hands. Come on.
Number 5, Jerry Lee Lewis.
You broke my will, but what a thrill. Goodness and gracious, great ball of fire.
Though he dabbled in blues and country, Jerry Lee Lewis molded the sound of rockabilly with his unique piano playing. Add his fiery voice and a whole lot of shaking on stage, and you've got rock and roll's first great eclectic and first great wild man. Despite the backlash around his marriage to his teenage cousin, the killer regained popularity and earned a platinum certified record almost 50 years after his debut.
I ain't thinking, a lot of shaking going on.
Number 4, Buddy Holly. In under 2 years, Buddy Holly did more for rock and roll than many bands will in their entire careers. As one of the first to write, produce, and sing his own songs, he appealed to both blacks and whites with his rockabilly, country, and R&B mix. Holly also popularized the use of 2 guitars, a bass, and drums with the Crickets. Despite his tragic death, he left us albums worth of material to discover and enjoy.
Oh, well, I love you, gal, and I want you peg it through.
Number 3, Little Richard.
You just said that loud enough. Say it again, honey. The king. Thank you.
He could wail, croon, moan, scream, and shout. By merging R&B and boogie woogie with mischievous lyrics, the architect of rock and roll planted the seed for soul and funk. He could also rip it up at the ball with his lively moves and smooth personality.
She brought me to the east. She brought me to the west. She's the girl that I love best.
Thanks to his secular and faith-based music, the wild and frantic Little Richard remains one of rock's most influential entertainers. Good golly, Miss Molly. Number 2, Chuck Berry. Roll over, Beethoven, because this is Chuck Berry.
Roll over, Beethoven. I got to hear it again today.
By introducing R&B and guitar solos to the genre, he laid down the law when it came to playing rock and roll. The sweet little rock and roller's original beats, stage bravado, and accompanying dance moves set the tone for the genre's growth and subsequent explosion.
Go, Johnny, go, go. Go, Johnny, go, go.
Even today, Chuck Berry continues to exude a rock and roll attitude at his shows.
Let me hear you say yeah. Let me hear you say yeah.
Number 1, Elvis Presley.
Baby, so just you are.
After fusing R&B with country, Elvis amped things up with electric guitars and added his emotional and versatile vocals to his rockabilly style.
I got the same old story from all night fears. You know there ain't no room around here for guitar man.
Flaunting good looks, sexy dance moves, and a rebellious image on stage and in film, the king of rock and roll had something for everybody.
He goes by the name of King Creole. You know he's gone, gone, gone.
By selling more records than any other solo artist, he also defined the genre and transformed pop culture, and for that, we love him tender. Who is your favorite rock and roll pioneer? Be sure to subscribe to WatchMojo.com for more entertaining top 10s.
I should give you a little taste there, and there are others, the Everly Brothers, Fats Domino's mentioned in the video, Little Richard, Chuck, and Jerry. Unfortunately, in 1959, when the narrator was covering Richie Valens, you see him bottom right, and Buddy Holly, Big Bopper, boarded a plane in Clear Lake, Iowa, and never made it in a snowstorm. They were supposed to take the bus, but the bus's heating system had broke down, so Buddy Holly chartered a plane. And because of a coin flip, Richie Valens won a seat on the plane instead of having to take the bus. It was a coin flip between him and an artist named Eddie Cochran. And if you ever heard a song called Summertime Blues, Eddie Cochran sang that. He was part of when they went on tour, they kind of went on tour together, these rock and roll shows. So you had a lot of these artists did become friends, even though they performing and competing with each other as far as record sales, but they became friends and traveled together. And yeah, the seat was between Eddie Cochran and Richie, and Richie won the bet, but cost him his life. Inventions of the 1950s, as we close this out, you see your first TV remote control. Zenith was a very popular television manufacturer. There's a primitive remote control and answering machine. Make sure you know this for your final exam. The first mainframe computer was IBM. It came out the same year, but the first commercial computer that you purchased, mostly corporations, but big corporations, big businesses purchased these commercial computers. So there's your first one, 1951. It's known as UNIVAC. UNIVAC, that's all going to be on your final exam. Look at the size of that thing, right? Far cry from the laptops you use in class. Power steering. would be very difficult for many of us to get a license before 1951 because part of the problem, not that you couldn't drive, it's try driving a car without power steering and see what I mean. Going to 1952, you have games I'm sure we've all played, like Mr. Potato Head. There you go, the transistor radio on the bottom, which helped to promote rock and roll and young teenagers, who were supposed to be going to bed and going to sleep, turn on their little transistor radio while mom and dad is asleep and listen to music or the baseball game or news. In 1953, Dr. Jonas Salk announces the discovery of the vaccine for poliomyelitis, polio. Too bad it was in 1940, or earlier, and maybe President Roosevelt would be able to walk had he had the vaccine. But yeah, and hopefully, for me, I have faith in vaccines. Anything I ever did in my life, as far as sports, if I wanted to play high school football, I had to get my shots, and Little League baseball to get my shots. And 1953, Jonas Salk, that is on your test. In 1954, Sports Illustrated, Burger King actually came out a year before McDonald's in Miami. Burger King came out of Miami, Florida. However, they did not franchise. That's what separates Burger King from what will happen a year later with Kentucky Fried Chicken, McDonald's, same year Disneyland. There's the original McDonald's there, top picture. McDonald's hamburgers. Portrayed in the movie Founder, if you ever get a chance to see it. But yeah, the beginning of franchising. So that's why McDonald's became much bigger in the beginning than Burger King, even though Burger King was first, technically. Then 1956, you'll see the first, look at that computer hard disk. And then the videotape recorder on the right. You could record a TV show. Look at how small the TV is there. But it was just some inventions there. And so you have 2 PowerPoints that close out chapter 25. And when we get together next week on Monday, and I have Tuesday class. So Monday and Tuesday, we will begin with chapter 26 in the Civil Rights Movement.